I'm Schmelke Diamond, and this is Sorry, Not Sorry. Hi, everyone. It's Schmelke. Welcome to episode 2 of Sorry, Not Sorry. First, I want to thank everybody for the wonderful feedback that I've gotten from the first episode and the informative feedback. We are trying to launch across various platforms. Originally, I thought Spotify is where everybody kind of heard their podcast. And then I found out that a lot of people don't have access to it, so we are now on Zing, which is amazing. Thank you to everybody who helped with that. So, yes, soon my goal is that we should be available wherever you get your podcast. So what's the point of today's episode? Before I bring on some guests who I can't wait for all of you to meet, I think that it's a good idea, and somebody pointed this out to me, and I totally agree with it, to give you kind of a deeper dive into who I am and where I come from. And, you know, a lot of people have said to me, well, why are you the way you are? And I think, even though so much of my life has been public, whether it be an article or an interview or a speech, you can only learn so much about a person from that glimpse that you get. That's the tip of the iceberg. And the truth is, to most people, we're just strangers. So before I kind of bring on my friends, I'm a big believer in this idea that you can only judge a person when you understand the context in which they existed, their history, their baggage, all of that stuff. And I've certainly been judged a lot in my life. I think a lot of you have too. So before you judge me, take time to know me. So I'm going to take this opportunity to be vulnerable, to be raw, but I'm going to also do it because there's strength in vulnerability. And I'm going to pull back the curtain and, behind the glamour that I've portrayed really well, or maybe some of you haven't even seen that glamour, so I can't wait to show that to you, but also to show you some of the adversity that I went through, really stemming from, unfortunately, a very, very, very young age. The thing about me is that I am very proud in saying that I'm kind of weird. I'm different, and I've always been different. And sometimes I pride myself on that. I do incredibly just different things, whether it be in investing, buying companies that other people wouldn't, whether in the stock market, whether it be my vast collections, um, my, choice to actually become a Husid, as we said before, that was perceived as a little strange. Um, but most of you would think that in order to be kind of outwardly different and vocarious and vivacious and, viewed as this sort of larger than life thing and talkative and bubbly, I have to have a huge amount of self-confidence. The opposite is actually true. I have a horrendously low amount of self-confidence, and I have a terror that has just lingered throughout my life of loneliness, of being unsafe. You know, one of the things that I am not is bipolar, but you could be forgiven, and I could forgive myself for mistaking me as bipolar, because my life has just my life has just existed in the space of extremes. I have had highs that are unbelievable and things that, as someone once said, I didn't even dare to dream of. Becoming engaged, becoming a Husin, and having my l'chaim made at the Satmar Rebbe's dining room table. Um, in less spiritual terms, you know, traveling the world and, being able to go places that I never imagined I'd go, having VIP treatment in certain places because of, well, let's face it, my my father's career in politics and, being able to go to a baseball game and, just having, knowing somebody in security and having them zip you through to the lounge, which is actually funny because I hate sports, but that is something that I do remember having done. To some really horrible lows, lows that I actually think most of us don't go through. Health, losing the ability to walk without a mobility aid, getting a brain disease at the age of, what was I, 29? Um, your career kind of belly flopping, an identity crisis causing that. And also yeshivish neighbors. That was also really, hard in life. Okay, I'm joking about that. Sort of. Sorry, not sorry. Oh, and another thing is, I do apologize if I sound like a dying walrus, but I am fighting a very bad cold, and because my body is kind of so schwach from the pain as it is, anytime that like a cold or allergies come up, it just becomes like kind of like getting hit by a car. So excuse me next time. I hope to have a much nicer voice. So, where do we start? So, sorry, I just drank my tea. Okay, so let's start where I was born. The year was 1994, and I was raised in a little place called North New Hyde Park, which later, as I guess the real estate market exploded, gentrification happened, kind of turned into a more affluent Lakeville Estates. Um, but it was a very unique place to live because it was my street where I grew up, Patton Boulevard, led into Queens on one end, which when I became later from, and my parents became later from, our shul was actually technically in Queens, even though we lived on Long Island. And it was only, a 15-minute walk. New Hyde Park is this relatively blue collar, I would say working class, or at best middle class town. Of course, now today everything's blown up, and especially with the Chinese market having moved in there, nothing is really what it was back then. But back then, it was considered this very like kind of gray, middle class, middle of nowhere place, but at the tip of Great Neck. Now, Great Neck is probably one of, if not the most unique places that one can ever go to in their life. Great Neck is part of the Gold Coast of Long Island. The Gold Coast, which means the North Shore. A lot of people think of Long Island, they think of the South Shore. And it's funny because growing up, I'm not talking about the frum world, although even in the frum world, the Five Towns does sort of have this image of flash and, kind of the show. But we, meaning anybody on the North Shore, really didn't generally view the Five Towns as our peers. We viewed them as sort of the wannabes. We were the moneyed class, so to speak. But in general, the word was class. It wasn't necessarily about money or what you spent or how much you displayed your home. It was about your class, and that was something that we truly believed that we had. And, we would refer to it a little bit as, and again, I hate for using this term and I apologize, but, NOCD, not our class, dear. Um, you know, but the difference was, and again, sorry for saying that. I know I'm a jerk. I know, but you can take the boy out of the nursery, you can't take the nursery out of the boy. So the interesting thing about it, though, was that even before anybody was from, I mean, I'm talking about public school world, they were always more religious than we were. Yiddishkeit was always more of a factor there than it was by us. In the North Shore, you would have a bar mitzvah 90% of the time, well, maybe 60, 70, 80 at a Reform temple, a minority at a conservative temple. In the Five Towns, even if the people were not Shomer Shabbos, I don't think there was even one Reform temple there. There might have been literally one that people went to. The people there were just 100 steps ahead of us in terms of Yiddishkeit. And so, say what you want about the culture there, about the society there, which, coming as somebody who, let's just face it, was born, into a certain social rung and raised around that rung, and therefore is kind of uncomfortable around that, like, kind of vast overdoing it, so to speak, that you see a lot on Central Avenue. Um, I give them tremendous props because more, they were further ahead than we ever were, and probably the North Shore will ever be in terms of orthodoxy. And now, Baruch Hashem, there's, 5 shuls on every block. So I grew up kind of stuck in between these two worlds, which is why I often thought of myself as like kind of somebody from Queens, which is kind of what probably something my mother would be proud of. Queens was in a way very upper class, but also very diverse. And that's what my mother wanted for me. My father as well. But, my mother in particular really, really was against this whole idea of, the bubble of high society, high sobriety, of, where I went to school in the morning. And again, this is public school. I'm sorry, where I went to school, which public school, but in the morning, the line of, the Acuras and the Mercedes Benz and everything else, the mother's having a full face of makeup at 7:30 in the morning to drop the kids off. Um, my mom, when I was born, my mom and my dad. My dad was 42 and my mother was 38. My father was a prosecutor at that point, but he had taken a step back from being a prosecutor, and his best friend, I guess my uncle, or, godfather, however you'd call it, but I refer to him as Uncle Hank Morris, a very, very, very famous political consultant and former financier, decided to, as a side venture, open up a restaurant, go into the restaurant business. And my father was the person he chose to run it. So we had we had 2 breakfast restaurants called Le Peep, one in Edison, one in Paramus. The one in Edison is actually still there. And for anyone who's thinking of asking, no, they were not kosher at all, but this is what it is. You know, my dad learned how to cook like nobody else, and Baruch Hashem, today, I can still say he's an amazing cook. He's actually an amazing guy in general. You would really love him, and both of my parents are really, really, really good people. Incredibly different from one another. And I would actually say that I probably take a little bit more after my mother, which is probably why we have a slightly crazier relationship than I do with my father. Mom, if you're hearing this, sorry. But my dad is just the kindest, most jovial person you'll ever meet. Generous, open-hearted. Anyhow, so of course we all know that he sort of later became a Supreme Court judge, faced tremendous adversity as a Republican running in this really liberal district. Took him 4 times, 2 nominations, but he finally won when I was 9 years old. And not only did he win, but he won Supreme Court. Now, of course, not only did he show them that he could win, but he wound up serving 17 and a half years and was one of the most preeminent, and actually still is one of the most preeminent med mal, personal injury, guardianship, elder law scholars, I would say, in the state. Now, my mother was slightly different. My mother came from, I would say, you know, a somewhat more affluent family than my father did. Actually, very much so more. And yet, unlike my aunt, who I will get to in just a moment, you know, who became a glamorous housewife, my mother became a lawyer in an era when, women were just not expected to take on those roles. And not only did she become a lawyer, but she became a divorce lawyer, which is, for those of you who are not acquainted, and I hope none of you are, probably the messiest, ugliest version of law that one can practice. And to add to what she took upon herself, And kind of to show you the skin that she's got, she was a father's rights attorney in Long Island. So you imagine this kind of young Jewish girl from Queens walking into this, sort of waspy or, on the other end, blue collar, these Irish guys, Italian guys who were fighting for rights to see their kids, and they're hiring her. And that's how she made her name. And 40 something years later, she's still working. But, she and my uncle had a law firm called Fishkin and Pugash. So they were already established professionals by that point. And, my mom really did not want me growing up in that, and I hate to use the word because I hate to kind of glorify it, but in a way it was glorious. That magical bubble of Great Neck, right? She just didn't want that for me. Now, that didn't work for a few reasons. First reason was that if you don't want to raise somebody somewhere, you don't send them to school in that neighborhood. If you don't want somebody growing up around certain values, and again, I'm sorry if I'm, in any way talking against my mother. We've had this conversation a zillion times, and I'll probably have this written on my headstone, and I guess she'll have, I disagree written on hers. If you're going to try to say, I don't want somebody around those values, right? Like in my instance, I don't want somebody going to, a modern cheder, then I wouldn't then go and move into this, quote, really modern neighborhood. So that didn't work for that reason. The other reason, though, that it kind of really didn't work for was because when I was about 6 months old, my parents were really living this lovely life. They bought this house in North New Hyde Park that I would kind of later, almost kind of a very strange house. And it was strange because, like so many other things in our family, it just wasn't it just wasn't concrete in the sense that we were always saying, well, it's a starter house and we're going to move next year, so we'll just do this and we'll just do that. And then, you'd kind of add a room here and rebuild there. And of course, you wind up spending a ton, and you they lived there for 30 something years. Not complaining because it turned out to be a really good investment, but still. But anyhow, I mean, it's really not about my childhood house. So they were living their, nice newlywed life. And then 6 months after I was born, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. And, there wasn't, I mean, it was the 1990s. So granted, research had come pretty far by that point, but it was still a pretty devastating diagnosis to have to go through, even if it was a more mild form of it. I don't remember the um I don't remember that at all, obviously, and really Baruch Hashem for that. But I was allegedly 6 months old, and I was sitting. She was pushing me in a stroller in an oncologist's office. Now, I don't care how tough a person is. How devastating is that for a parent to have to go through? And she went to this wonderful oncologist, up on Long Island. You've got the best medical care that one could possibly ask for. And Baruch Hashem, I don't think she even needed chemo. She did radiation, she had surgery, and it went away. So she went back to her life. And, we were, I guess, she was a new parent, rebuilding her business. And then somehow or other, she had an issue in her arm that turned out to require surgery. And in that surgery, she planned to be out of work for, I don't know, 3 days. And, it shouldn't have had any impact on our life at all. But during that procedure, something was botched and she had severe nerve damage. She woke up and she couldn't move her arm. She was basically, paralyzed in one part of her body, like the arm. Don't know who was the left or the right, but essentially the pain that caused, the physical pain, as I would unfortunately come to experience a little bit of that myself, 30 years later, left her largely incapacitated. And the only treatment they had available at the time was something that I would again later come to use called gabapentin. Gabapentin is a drug that was actually developed by, of all places, the Israeli drug industry for the IDF, um, for soldiers who had sustained damage in battle that wasn't specifically treatable, right? Like not a broken arm or an amputation or whatever, but kind of to treat pain within the central nervous system. Gabapentin, it was called Neurontin, was the brand name, and that was really the only thing that they could give her. Now, thank God, that treatment eventually worked, and she sort of got some of her life back. And then sometime around when I'd say I was 2, she she went in for another procedure. And again, I'm sorry if I sound confused, if I'm grasping for details, but I obviously remember very, very, very little of this. And this isn't something that we sit and talk about at the dinner table, um, because these are painful memories. But I think it's important to share. So I'll keep going. So she had another procedure done, I think to probably treat the nerve damage. Anesthesiologist comes in, he puts her out, which is what anesthesiologists do, and they get paid astronomically to do that. And she wakes up, has a chemical reaction to the anesthesia, and it's hepatitis. So, and the best part of it is, I mean, the best part, the craziest part is it's not A or B, it's not treatable. There was no treatment for it. So she was essentially given a death sentence. You know, I mean, one of the most horrendous stories about it was that she couldn't figure out if it was something in her liver or this or that, because hepatitis is a liver disease. And she went to another doctor who called her up, on a Friday afternoon and said, "Yeah, hi, it's Dr. So and so. I looked at your scan. I think it's liver cancer, probably stage 4, but I can't talk. I'm being honored at an awards dinner. Be in touch on Monday." Now, this was devastating. Okay. She was completely bedbound. Now, these are where my earliest memories do start to come in. My father had to take me almost every Saturday and Sunday to the ball pit at the local McDonald's because I had to be out of the house. She was on constant bed rest. I remember visiting her in her bedroom and her being completely laid up. And my mother was, she was somebody who is somebody. She is somebody with a tremendous amount of strength. And to see her, in such pain, a child trying to connect with their mother, a child at such a young, impressionable, developmentally crucial age, and their parent is physically unable to, be there with them. Well, that had to have left a tremendous amount of, damage, a feeling of insecurity, of instability within me. And really against all odds, you know, I guess one could say this might have inspired me in my faith a little bit many years later, although I never put it together. You know, she recovered, and she recovered from something that had no treatment, I guess through whatever, remedy medications they could give her, and her strength, probably her strength not to give up the opportunity to be a mother after having waited 38 years. And no matter what came after that within our relationship, because I'm sure that that sort of planted the seeds for, a little bit of a disconnect, a sense of, I guess, a child feeling a sense of abandonment. Well, I've never said this publicly before, but okay, here we go. And her probably feeling, I'm going to use the term resentful at upon her recovery, being expected to, you know, toe the line, with her society where she lived and all of that. I mean, her priority was getting back to herself, not impressing the rest of the world, and also not trying to be her son's best friend. It's a very popular thing now in the secular world, and a lot of people say it's a problem, is that, parents are like their kid's best friend. And that isn't really how it worked with us. Now, I'm 3 at that time, and again, crazy life, right? You're born, and, my mother establishes this law firm. My dad is, now an entrepreneur. Then she gets sick, recovers, gets sick, recovers, gets sick again, really sick, and then recovers. And I actually think she may have even recorded, I mean, again, these are my memories, okay? I think that she recorded certain tapes of herself talking or whatever, so that if, God forbid, she wasn't there, I'd have what to remember her by. And these are the earliest memories that I have, that feeling of aloneness and kind of not knowing what tomorrow would bring is basically where my formative years were. But again, she recovered and rebuilt her business and, made it better than ever. And then in 1998, once she had fully recovered and, was just unbreakable, looking great and being there, you know, my father decided that he had had enough of the business world and he wanted to become a judge. And the opportunity came up. Pataki nominated him, Governor Pataki at the time. And one of my very, very first memories is sitting at the state capitol in Albany. I recently actually found the transcript of that Senate hearing of my father, I guess, of my father being confirmed or formally nominated, whatever that process is referred to, by the Senate. And I still remember this like gray houndstooth jacket that I wore to that sports jacket that I wore to that in Albany. And I actually think I lost it. Um, anyway, sorry, Mama, about that too, losing that sport jacket, because that was probably a good jacket. But anyhow, the swing, right? The pendulum swinging back and forth and back and forth. So then he gets nominated and he, is put in the courtroom. And as wonderful as that was, and yes, it was devastating when he lost, but, don't worry, he wasn't unemployed. He then went to go work in the financial publishing industry in what was then a very, very booming business. Also a venture with my Uncle Hank. And my father, even though he had lost the election, was nominated again by Pataki and was building up such a name for himself. And we were spending such an exorbitant amount of time in these political circles, you know, that world of adulthood, of politics, of, these very kind of high intellectual topics became our entire life. We were enmeshed in it. We were, you know, I went from being a 3-year-old child who was in nursery school, actually kicked out of the first nursery school for misbehaving, to campaigning and having to pose for pictures. It's 3 years old. Smile. Don't smile too much. Tilt your head the right way. Front and center. Okay, family, stand like this. Okay, the kid go in the middle of the two parents. Now you stand on the side. Okay, and here, little Spencer, this is so-and-so, and he's the chairman of the party. Chairman Mandello, nice to meet you, right? All of these things that my son, who's now 4, I couldn't even fathom him sitting there and watching campaign ads and saying, okay, this is the problem with this one. This is how that one works. But, this is what our life was. And so, the fun parts of that were meeting these incredibly powerful people. My Uncle Hank got married and my father was the best man. And 2 of the people who he had built politically, were Chuck Schumer and Dianne Feinstein. Chuck Schumer very, very, very famously unseated Al D'Amato, and Al D'Amato would later send my uncle a keychain. Again, these are all stories that I remember from childhood, thanking him for being, for having lost the election, because as soon as he went into private industry, he became a very wealthy man. Anyhow, um, so my dad gets up at the mic as the best man. If anybody is not familiar with that, it's, the groom, the Husin, takes his best friend or somebody and, is like I guess like the witness. And at the party, they make a speech. So my dad gets up to the mic and it's held at my uncle's house, this palatial, estate in East Hampton where I spent, very many days of my summers in my youth and teenage years. So dad gets to the mic and he says to Chuck Schumer, well, you might be the best congressman. And then he says to Dianne Feinstein, he points there and he says, and you might be the best senator, but I'm the best man and I'm giving this toast. So, obviously these are not things that most people have experienced or would relate to. Um, you know, every year our holiday dinners were with the late, great Dennis Dillon, a lovely man who really built my father's career. He was the district attorney of Nassau County, though. And at 4 years old, I was sitting there at holiday dinners with the district attorney, and we were arguing about politics. We were discussing these really, topics that I'm not going to get into here, but, being 9 or 10 years old, and I'll never forget, it was a cold night when Bush got reelected the second time, but I was out campaigning the Republicans. That was my life. The war in Iraq started when I was in third grade, and I would sit during recess and I would just open atlases and I would go through atlases and kind of look at maps of Europe and the Middle East and, try to understand like what was going on. And I remember that somebody actually told my parents that I shouldn't be allowed to watch the news networks, right? You think of kids today not being allowed to have social media and whatever. I wasn't allowed to watch MSNBC. Why was I watching MSNBC? I don't know. But I wasn't allowed to watch it because I remember my third grade teacher even said, "You're making me nervous. Stop." Like you're focusing on the war. If they're going to invade, if they're going to do this. So as funny as that is for me to recount today, the issue with it is that most third graders do not understand those concepts. They're not interested in those concepts, you know, and I was kind of just alone. I was a different person. I was weird, I was unique. And today it might be more appreciated. In those days, it really wasn't very appreciated. And, my home life, to the point that my parents really, really did try their best. By the time I got to be 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, they were both well into their careers. My father was over 50. My mother was in her mid-40s. She had literally survived by a thread. Baruch Hashem, she did survive and got stronger than ever, but she was, she was working and she was doing, and they just didn't connect with kids in the way that their friends who had their kids 20 years earlier did. I think that I definitely am nowhere near as, quote, stable as a person as my parents were when I had my first kid. I was 25, but I could relate to him in such an easier way. So home life was a little bit stilted. I was sort of, well, today you call it parentified or adultified. And people have often called us like a three-legged stool, right? We're not, it wasn't the typical structure of two parents and a kid. It was kind of a kid, this inner child, almost like a Peter Pan of never really getting to be a child and having to be an adult from a very, very young age and not being allowed to make the mistakes that kids make. I always say, like in high school, I was driving by actually last week, the high school that I went to with my wife. And, of course, I had to look at the student parking lot to see what the cars that were popular now are. But there was this like thing called the Mirror Building. And the Mirror Building was this office building, like a professional office building, very 80s looking. It was built entirely of mirrors on the outside or glass. And the kids, quote, the cool kids, used to sneak off during lunch. And instead of getting school lunch, or as some of us would have done, delivery, right? I know how crazy that sounds, but they would sneak off to the Mirror Building and they would get like iced coffee and a sandwich. And you weren't really allowed to do that because you weren't allowed to leave school premises, but you did. And I never had the guts to do that. I mean, I was like never, I was never, I never felt the freedom to be immature and stupid and young like that. And, I was saying, like, if I could tell my younger self anything, I'd be like, do it. Go sneak off to the Mirror Building and go buy your lunch and enjoy your iced coffee because you will not be a size 32 waist for much longer, especially once that Thursday night Kegel and Chillin' start. Anyway, sorry. So back from my complaining. But what I did have at home was that down the block was my aunt and uncle and their two children. Now, because we were only three grandchildren for the entire family, which for most Heimische people, most Frum people, is unfathomable. Even in a modern Orthodox family, let's say, where, there might only be three or four kids in the family, but still, each of them having another three or four kids, but we were three. I was the baby. The oldest, Sherry, is 14 years older than me. The middle one, Greg, is 9 years older than me. And my aunt was a very, very typical stay-at-home mother. Um, Always had the most beautiful house, always had, the most beautiful things, and hosted and did and kind of did all those domestic, quote, babatische things that we did not, right? We were at political fundraisers. She hosted parties for the Temple Sisterhood. Totally different vibes, and in a way, I kind of grew up a lot in their home. And, we weren't cousins as much as we were like brothers and sisters. You know, me being the baby, as kind of different and weird as I was, and again, I'm still saying weird, right? Like, I'm 31 now. Why do I not have the confidence to say I was just different? Why am I making it negative? But I am, because that's how I still see it. But anyway, I was still the baby in the family, so my my Bobby Elavashulam, you know, loved me, and I was always given those special privileges that the youngest gets. The youngest rolls the ball. The oldest was the star. She was the person, in most from homes, the children sort of gravitate around the parents, right? In the Hasidic world, typically what happens is that during the Shidduch, the boy, the Husin, will go to move where the girl lives so that she can be near her family. Well, in our world, the parents were like the stars and the children were the moon, particularly with my oldest cousin. She was the most popular girl in high school. I had no friends, so she became like my best friend. And of course, she wound up going to college and becoming a hugely successful doctor, ENT doctor based out of Florida. Of course, she married another doctor who she met during residency, and today he's a plastic surgeon. Both wonderful people living this fabulously wealthy, almost like fantasy life. And I hope that I can get maybe him or their kid on there today on here because I would really love to hear their perspective, and I can't thank her enough and her husband for really showing up for me as a sibling when I had no siblings, when I didn't have anybody, and for sort of making me feel like I had that safe sibling environment of, you know, the family that gets you, the siblings who just, have your back. And again, my parents got me, right? We're very close. I mean, I can talk to my dad 2 or 3 times a day, but it's totally different between having like that sibling environment and that just, calm whatever world versus a parent-child environment, no matter how adult that child is. Unfortunately, my older cousin, her younger brother, really, really experienced middle child syndrome in probably the worst of ways because she was the star and I was the baby and I was actually her protege. I was supposed to follow in her steps and have this wildly successful career as well, and, have the best social circles and this and that. And for some reason, they never really paid attention to him. He was never really part of that. And as life would have it, he's now, well into his 40s. And I'm truly sorry for kind of making him feel left out of the picture. We were really like three kids out of a 90s sitcom. There's an old joke by a Jewish comedian that if your kid is brilliant, they become a doctor. If they're all right, they become a lawyer. And if they're retarded, sorry for saying the word, they become a CPA, an accountant. And in our family, the oldest is the doctor, the middle one's the lawyer, and I'm the CPA. I was the CPA, which we'll get into at another time. I'm kind of done with that world for now. But that gave me the strength, particularly that relationship of, kind of having a peer, someone I could spill my secrets to, a sibling, a big sister, a big brother, whoever, that I could just ride my bike over to their house or get off the bus early, you know, or if I had a fight, as I often did at home, to kind of know that I could run to my aunt and she would, and occasionally still does, call up my parents and say, look, he didn't really mean to say that, and, kind of play peacemaker. Um, but you can imagine that, this whole thing of, growing up between here and there, right? Being, too good for the middle class neighborhood and made to feel internally like you weren't enough for the wealthy neighborhood. Being a child with, a parent who's physically unable to bond with you the way they need to in those formative years, right? And then growing up completely surrounded by adults, which kind of gave you nothing relatable to be able to discuss with kids. Um, and then, ultimately that isolation at school left me realizing that the only way that I could ever find true acceptance and really, I hate to use the word, but to feel loved was through fame and through recognition. And, when I would be campaigning for my dad or whoever else, and I'd be out at a Republican gala and our picture would be taken, or I'd go into the courtroom and everybody would rush over, and I see it right now that they were, just trying to be nice, but, trying to kind of kiss up to the boss's family. I'd go into my mother's office and I'd parade around and everybody would say, he's so smart, he's going to do something. And everybody in the court would say, oh, hello, Spencer, how are you, right? When I'd sit at the dinner tables in East Hampton, surrounded by a bunch of 50-somethings, and I would be able to talk about my feelings on the Iraq War, and everybody would just sit there and listen, I equated that level of attention with, love and with safety and with feeling validated, which really set kind of a dangerous path in my life of, well, I'll only ever feel fulfilled and I'll only ever feel safe or I'll only ever feel like, my life is really worth it if the world believes that, if the world tells me something, and I can't do anything without everybody telling me that it's the best thing that I could ever possibly do. And so, there is kind of a price to prominence and there's a price to everything and there's a purpose for it. But, like just the other day I was in a store and I'm going to be incredibly, annoying about it and say a very, very high end store. And I made a purchase that I thought was pretty substantial. And I said something to my sales rep about, you know, oh, am I a VIP customer here because the store had done me a favor, extending the return policy? And no, not in like a, stereotypical, Heimish people taking advantage of return policies. Nothing like that, right? Just like, which by the way, we do not do that. For anyone listening who is not a Heimish person, we do not do that. But I was in the store and I said something like, oh, I'm a VIP, right? And my sales rep was like, no. And it was like, what? But I spend so much money a year in this store. And they were like, yeah, but we have people who come in and spend, $20,000 a month. And my wife said to me, she's like, don't worry, you'll get there one day. And I was like, but I thought I'm a VIP. Aren't I a VIP? And the entire ride home, I was sitting and I was just like almost stewing at this notion that I wasn't a VIP in in somebody's eyes. And then I realized, how little can a person be? Am I like a snowflake? Well, in some ways I am. I my need for validation from others developed into something called people pleasing, which is really one of the most horrific things you can do. It destroys yourself, it destroys your sense of identity. Not that I ever really had one, but I kind of have started to accept the fact after so much work, you know, literally over 20 years of therapy, continuously, that I actually don't need to be called a VIP in a store to feel like a VIP. I'm still hurt by it. So, as petty and stupid and immature as that sounds, um, and you guys go ahead and judge me for that one, because, VIP status in a store versus, like other important issues, the war in Iran, whatever. I kind of see that, like, I'm not the biggest deal, but I think that a lot of us struggle with validation. I think that a lot of us have, you know, unresolved childhood stuff. Maybe that inner child within us, or our inner whatever it is. And I can say that I've worked really, really hard to get away from people pleasing, and obviously it's kind of a vicious cycle. You still kind of fall back into it sometimes, but somebody explained to me, I forget who, and maybe enough people told me that I started to believe it, that the only validation really comes from yourself, right? And I'm not going to go into this like guru stuff now, but I do hope to have some people on here who could discuss that further and address that further. Um, but I kind of want to end this just by saying that, going forward into this has been kind of a dark episode, but it's also kind of a funny episode because now you understand whoever I'm going to speak to, whatever happened, whatever is going to happen on this podcast, whatever else I'm going to share, perhaps the reasons that, or the thought process that led me to those decisions. I hope that all of you hear this and understand that, again, you're not alone. And if you're somebody who needs validation, just know that you probably don't need it as badly as I do. And you probably have not gone to the lengths for that validation and for that quote unquote love that I have. Not that I recommend that any of you go to those lengths, or really any lengths, because at the end of the day, you are yourself. And if somebody doesn't appreciate the gift that you are, that's on them. Of course, there are bad behaviors that we can change. Hello, I need to change like quite a few of my own, but I've come to learn, like I have a neighbor who moved in from Argentina fairly recently. And I tried to explain to the kids. And when I said this, I heard this from somebody, and I say the same thing whenever I see somebody, whatever it is, in a wheelchair or this or that. The things about you that are different, that make you different from everybody else, that is your magic. If you believe in like fairy tales or whatever, like those are your magic powers. That makes you special. That is your gift from above. And you take that and run with it. So I look forward to speaking with you guys hopefully next week. Again, I hope this thing is a little bit better put together by then. And can't wait for you to meet some amazing people. Have a great week, everybody. Thank you. And as always, sorry, not sorry.